we go. Chapter 15, Lonely Lake Monster. That Thing in Aisle 5, Chapter 15. Pearl was determined to make everything right all by herself. Once she reached the front of the hospital, she started across the lawn and then stopped dead in her tracks. A police car was parked on the road next to Mrs. Mulberry's car. Ugh, Aunt Millie, Pearl grumbled as she crouched out of sight in the tall grasses. Aunt Millie, known as Officer Millie to the rest of the residents of Buttonville, worked the day shift for the Buttonville police force. She was standing next to the squad car, her thumbs hooked in her belt loops, her navy shirt neatly tucked into her navy pants. Sunlight streamed along the polished rims of her dark glasses. Mrs. Mulberry was talking to Officer Millie. Pearl couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but she was waving her arms around with frantic gestures. Victoria Mulberry sat on the sidewalk, reading her book, paying no attention to her busybody mother. Moving on all fours, as sly as a tiger, Pearl made her way across the field. The last thing she wanted to do was talk to her aunt and the Mulberrys, so she headed toward the distant section of the wrought iron fence. The fence had been designed with sharp points at the top, which made it very dangerous to climb up and over. During their first visit, when they had brought the dragon hatchling, Pearl and Ben had climbed over the front gate, which didn't have any sharp points. But with Aunt Millie and the Mulberrys in the way, the gate was not an option. Luckily, on one of her adventuring days, Pearl had discovered a narrow fence segment where the points had rusted away. The area was particularly camouflaged by a cluster of trees, and so after tossing her flip-flops to the other side, she pulled herself up and over and landed on the sidewalk. Darting behind a tree, Pearl quieted her breath and listened. Although she could hear Millie and the Mulberrys talking, they stood many yards away. The breeze carried the conversation right to Pearl's ears. "So let me get this straight," Officer Millie said. "You called the police department to report an emergency, and the emergency was that you saw a very small person." "It was a very small person," Mrs. Mulberry said. "So you saw a child?" "No, not a child, for goodness sake. How could he be a child? He had a beard. He was very small, and he was very bearded." Officer Millie cleared her throat. "There are no laws against being small." "But who is he? That's what I want to know. I am the president of the Buttonville Welcome Wagon. It is my job to know if somebody new comes to Buttonville." "Maybe it was a friend of Dr. Wu's," Officer Millie said. "But he was with your niece, Pearl Petal." "Pearl is working for Dr. Wu, and so is Ben Silverstein." "And why is that? Pearl is known as a troublemaker, and Ben just moved here. Why didn't Dr. Wu hire my daughter? Victoria is a straight-A student, and she never gets into trouble." "I don't want to work for Dr. Wu, Mom. I don't like worms." "Oh, be quiet, dear, and read your book," Mrs. Mulberry said. Her voice grew louder and more insistent. "Officer Millie, it is your job to help the residents of Buttonville, and we need your help. This entire situation is mysterious and sneaky. The gate is locked. We can't get in. I want you to order Dr. Wu to open the gate." "There are no laws against locking gates on private property," Officer Millie pointed out. "But I am the president of the Welcome Wagon." Pearl didn't have time to listen to any more of this nonsense. After slipping back into her flip-flops, she hurried across the road, glancing over her shoulder to make certain she hadn't been spotted. Mrs. Mulberry and her Aunt Millie were still talking, Victoria still reading. And as fast as she could, Pearl ran to town, wishing all the while she was wearing a pair of leprechaun running shoes made from the wind. How many rules had she broken today? She lost count. After charging through the dollar store door, she bumped right into her mother. "What is the matter?" Mrs. Petal asked, grabbing hold of Pearl's shoulders. "Are you okay?" Yeah, I'm okay." Pearl wiped beads of sweat from the back of her neck. "Why are you out of breath? And why is your face red?" But before she could ask any more questions, a bell rang. Mr. Brimfinkle, a retired button factory worker, was waiting at the checkout counter with a basket of shoe polish and greeting cards. Mrs. Petal leaned close to her daughter and whispered, "You're not in trouble, are you?" "No," Pearl replied honestly, because she wasn't in trouble. Well, not yet. And she wouldn't be if she got back to the hospital before Mr. Tabby noticed the leprechaun was missing. Mrs. Petal smiled with relief and kissed Pearl's cheek, and then she began to ring up Mr. Brimfinkle's items at the register. Pearl had come to the dollar store to collect 2 things. She hurried past Lemonface, who clung to his perch, singing to his reflection. At the top of the stairs, she veered left and into her bedroom, where she grabbed the Pot o' Gold game from the shelf. After tucking the Sasquatch catching certificate inside a different game, Pearl dumped the plastic container of leprechauns and rainbows and gold pieces onto the carpet. She'd clean those up later. She emptied the pot and had it in her hand, and she hurried back downstairs. The second thing that she had come to get was in the beauty supply section, aisle 5, where Pearl's father was straightening the shampoo bottles. "Say, that's a nice lab coat you got," he said. "You look very official." "Thanks, Dad." He looked at his watch. "Aren't you supposed to be at the worm hospital until 3? "Yeah, I'm just taking a break." "Where's Ben?" "Oh, he's back at the hospital doing worm stuff." "Worm stuff?" Mr. Petal scratched his bald head. "What kind of worm stuff?" Pearl's entire body tensed. He's feeding them. It's lunchtime." She scanned the shelves. Toothbrushes, no. Shower caps, no. Loofahs, no. Nail files. Aha! Mirrors. "Worms have lunchtime?" Mr. Petal laughed. "Well, what exactly do they eat?" "Worm food, Dad." Pearl grabbed the biggest mirror, a round one with a pink frame. "Can I have this? It's for the hospital." "For the worms?" Mr. Petal raised his eyebrows. "Why on earth would a worm need a mirror?" Pearl cringed. If there was a moment where she needed Ben, it was this moment. He knew how to come up with the best stories. She stammered, her thoughts racing. Would a worm want to look at its own reflection? Do worms have eyes? They live in the dark. Maybe they don't even have eyes. Pearl realized she didn't know the first thing about worms. She chewed on her lower lip. And wouldn't a mirror be dangerous to a worm? Mirrors reflect sunlight. If a mirror reflected the sun onto a worm, the worm would get all dried up. Isn't a dried up worm a dead worm? "It's not for the worms, Dad. It's actually for Dr. Wu. She's very pretty, and I wanted to give her a thank you present for letting me work at the hospital." Mr. Petal nodded. "Now that's very considerate." Over in his cage, Lemonface twittered in agreement. "I'm wondering now that there's a worm hospital in Buttonville. Maybe we should start carrying worm food in the store." "Good idea," Pearl called as she hurried out the aisle. "See you at 3 o'clock. Then, success nearly at hand, she ran around Mr. Brimfinkle and out the dollar store door. To be continued.